Hello, everyone, and welcome to the U.S. Center and our event, Integrating Climate Change into Economic Policies, Whole of Government Approaches. It's my honor to introduce again, for the second straight event, Alexia Latortue, the Assistant Secretary of Treasury for International Trade and Development.
Welcome, everyone, to this session that I'm very excited about. Some of you may remember that when President Biden was first elected, he organized very quickly a Climate Leaders Summit. And one of the things that struck me the most about this, watching him as an American citizen at the time, was how many cabinet members were involved in this event. And the message that I got out of this event was, to achieve our goals, it really requires a whole of government action. This is not just the work of a climate ministry or a finance ministry. It requires a whole of a government action. And that is exactly what this panel will be discussing. What are the levers that a country has to be able to deliver on the urgent climate ambition and action that we need? How do we use budgets? How do we use policy? How do we use fiscal policy to be able to achieve our goals? And so with that, I'm really delighted to invite our panel up, starting with the Director of the Office of Management and Budget in the United States, Shalonda Young. From Denmark, we have Minister Bruus, who's the Minister of Taxation. And you may be seated. And you may be seated. We're quite informal here. You don't have to wait. But thank you. And then from Uruguay, delighted to welcome the Minister of the Economy and Finance, Minister Abeleche. And from Canada, very happy to welcome Deputy Minister of the Environment and Climate, Jean-François Tremblay. All right, so with this fabulous panel, I'd like to start with Director Young. In the United States, and especially if you're in the government, everybody knows what the Office of Management and Budget is. But perhaps here, not all of our international guests do. So if you would first explain what your office is and why those three letters, OMB, are so powerful. And how you, what your perspective is on the work that you do developing and executing on trillions of dollars of U.S. government spending. What are some of the successes and challenges you have in trying to sort of really deliver on the climate agenda?
So one, thanks for having me. It's my inaugural COP. Since I've been in this job, I've either been pregnant or a parent of a now 2-year-old, so I don't get to get out much. But thanks to my parents for coming up from the state of Louisiana to Washington, D.C., so I could be here with all of you. And speaking of parents, my parents still don't know what I do. The Office of Management and Budget. Typically in other countries, these functions are in finance ministry and taxation ministry, but three major functions my office does. We sit in the executive office of the president. I'm responsible for putting the president's budget out. We manage a $6 trillion budget. Also responsible for the management of government. So when we want people to, for example, return to the office after COVID, I get all of the hate mail when I ask federal employees to do that. And also our regulatory agenda. You probably heard our Environmental Protection Agency put out a major piece of regulation on methane and regulating methane emissions from oil and gas. That came through my office as a major piece of legislation, and we do review and take interagency comments. So we are the very definition of all of government. We make sure that what our agencies are doing are reflective of what President Biden promised the American people. Agencies just don't get to go out and do what they want to do. We are the police of agenda. I'm often the queen of no. Sometimes I say yes, but you have to drag me to yes. But I tell people the reason I'm the queen of no, I want what we do to be lasting. So I want, when we tell you what our commitment is, we can deliver. I spent a lot of time, most of my career was in Congress. They are an equal branch of government. So we have to work closely with Congress to make sure that our pledges and what we do on the world stage are doable, that we can work with Congress to do those things. So I pressure test when we want to do things to make sure we can actually deliver. And speaking of delivering, we made a pledge on international climate finance to be at $11 billion. We're at over $9 billion now. That's huge. That's huge. Anybody read U.S. papers in Congress? That is huge. That we've been able to get that much in direct budget and also our leverage programs. I think you heard from our Vice President an announcement of $3 billion commitment in Green Climate Fund. We actually are still delivering on our announcement. We made $1 billion investment in Green Climate Fund earlier this year. And our Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law in our own country, we'll be able to invest over $500 billion in clean energy technology. Frankly, we talked a little about this earlier, that we think will be a benefit to our partners across the world. We're going to make these investments in technology that will be used everywhere, and hopefully at costs that places can afford as the U.S. government invests in newer technology. So it's an exciting time. But, you know, lots of questions about what happens next year, as you asked me earlier. We're going to protect the investments this president has won. They've been hard fought, and it's my job to linebacker these things. No one gets past here. Our Inflation Reduction Act, our climate investments are sacrosanct to this president, to this administration, and we're going to do everything in our power to implement on them now. Part of what I do too is to implement. It's one thing to get these resources, is another thing to implement it. And one of the hugest priorities that we are focused on at OMB and an administration, getting these dollars domestically to communities often left behind. I'm from Louisiana. Oil and gas reigns in Louisiana. We have communities who have cancer rates that clearly something's going on in those communities. Places that live between coal-fired plants that often don't have a say in what goes on in their community. We hope to change that. They need to be listened to. So we have what we call EJ40, Environmental Justice 40. 40% of the benefits of our investment needs to go to those communities. So that is of importance to us and one of the major focuses we have at OMB.
Thank you so much for that. And I think certainly everyone here at COP knows that the most vulnerable, wherever they are the first hit by the impacts of a changing climate. And so your personal story from Louisiana certainly resonates. And I think you've also heard that although she says she's Miss Snow, she also says yes. And you heard the example of the pledges that the vice president made. So she also says yes. You also touched on the IRA, Director Young, and you know, our belief that it would really help the adaptation of technologies around the world, not just in the United States. And actually, I want to turn to Minister Bruce now on this topic, because you use tax reform as a way to both incentivize climate action, but also to help drive public investment into new green technologies. So can you tell us more about how you do that?
Yeah, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. We're very delighted and appreciate it. Also, since we have a very close cooperation also with you in the US and with the US moderator. Actually, in many countries, you would lose an election if you were running on a billet saying, we're going to tax. Actually, it has been the other way around in Denmark. You could actually lose an election if you are not willing to put a tax on emissions. And so in 2019, we had a national election where the main focus and the main concern by the voters were actually climate change. And so after that election, we did a tax reform, the first of a couple green tax reforms, where we introduced carbon pricing on the Danish industries. I was elected Minister of Taxation in February last year, and that was actually the first task that I had on my at my table. And so we did an agreement with Parliament last summer. And so we're going to implement a carbon pricing tax or a tax on CO2 emissions from Danish industries from 2025 until 2030. And since then, we have done a tax reform on heavy trucks, also carbon pricing. At the moment, we are negotiating an aviation tax in the Danish Parliament. And in the spring, we're looking to see how can we create a carbon price or a CO2 tax on the agricultural sector. And so it's also, since right at the moment, we have a goal in Denmark to reduce by 70% in 2030 compared to 1990. And so we have very high, ambitious goals. And all this taxing, maybe you should be a tax minister to love it, but all the revenue obviously goes back to these sectors, and more so. So we also do subsidizing. We created a green fund where the money from the revenue from these carbon pricing taxes goes into. We added it with some pension taxes, and we support and subsidize industries that have the hardest time going through this green transition. Our framework of this is a Climate Act law that we did with almost all parties in the Danish Parliament, setting the framework and the principles of these legislation. Several of them, first of all, to create jobs, not lose jobs, make sure that companies don't move outside Denmark but stay in Denmark and go through the green transition. Make sure it's social balanced so we don't get yellow vests as we saw in France, etc., etc. And that's the framework, and that's also why we do this in a very close cooperation with the industries, with the sectors, and move forward so far successfully together in partnerships with these sectors. But and maybe we waited with the hardest, and then would be my ending remarks. Maybe we saved the hardest one to the end, because the agricultural sector is obviously very difficult. At the moment, it's around 30% of the CO2 emissions in Denmark. By 2030, it will be around half. So it's very big in Denmark, and so that's also why we have this task of actually reducing also from the agricultural sector. Otherwise, we won't reach our goal of 70% emission, 70% by 2030.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I may come back and want to learn more about the transparency of how you communicate about the use of the funds that are raised to the purposes that you described to build that trust also for that. But I'd like to turn now to Minister Arbeleche, and I'd like to hear from you, coming and leading a finance ministry. Now I think the conversation has changed from maybe 2 years ago, where in my view there was a sort of negative conversation around is it climate or is it development, and I think now we really are seeing climate and development as two intertwined goals. So I'd love to hear from you how you think about the integration of sort of economic policy with sort of with climate and policy and climate finance.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Alexia, for the invitation to participate in this panel. As you said at the beginning, it is essential for environmental policy and economic policy to work together if we really want to make progress in terms of sustainable development. In that sense, Uruguay's current administration, when we took office in 2020, we put in our budget law an article where we said that the economic policy was going to take into account environmental policy in its design and in its implementation. At that time, they sounded like quite broad, very general, but after that, what we did, in spite that we had the COVID like every other country in the world, we took specific steps to bring down to earth this main idea. So, as you said at the beginning, fiscal measures are very important. In the case of Uruguay, we after we went through a first energy transition, that took us today to a situation where almost all of our electric energy comes from renewable sources. Now we are facing a second transition, energy transition, and for that we have to put into place specific fiscal exemptions, benefits. For example, we implemented a tax on the emission of carbon dioxide from the gasoline that is equivalent to $150 per ton. So that's a lot. We have commented with Secretary Yellen about this, and it's very, very significant amount. We have exemptions on certain specific taxes on the purchase of electric vehicles, and currently we are working on giving important subsidies to the the public transportation, which will make a difference in terms of the second energy generation. The other fiscal measures, for example, on the agricultural area, so that we can give more sustainable path to our production of livestock and agriculture. For example, we give benefits to the maintenance of native forestry. Let me mention, Alexia, very quickly, a second point, not about fiscal measures, but about financial instruments, financial sustainable instruments. You know that this fits perfectly well in the evolution framework from the World Bank, because Uruguay is completely, totally, we think that it is putting in place the correct economic incentives that we're going to move forward in terms of having a better environmental results. So we think that countries should be distinguished according to the impact that they have on this global public good that it is environment. And those countries that have a better environmental performance should pay lower interest rate. So in October 21, Uruguay issued the first sustainability-linked bond. The interest rate of the bond is linked to key performance indicators that come from the NDC, from the Paris Agreement. That was the first time that the NDCs became financially binding, because up to now there was no consequence if we didn't reach those NDCs. So that is an important point, and it was the first time that a country was rewarded if it met its ambitious environmental targets. Just 2 weeks ago, in the World Bank's board, a loan was approved where the interest rate also has a step down. The country is rewarded if we fulfill certain environmental indicators. So I think that, again, this is a good example that can be replicable at a global level, where we align economic policy and environmental policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We were very proud to support that loan at the World Bank. So Deputy Minister Tremblay, you're the sole minister here who is from the environmental side. As you think about what must be a huge agenda on your plate, can you tell us a little bit about your interaction with the equivalent of those folks in Canada? They're not here, so you can be super honest. Is it working well? Are you getting what you need? How's that interaction?
They effectively are quite good at saying no. You're right. There's also something in Canada. If you're not from finance, you're not supposed to talk about finance, or you can have huge consequences coming. But I would take it from I was before also Deputy Minister of Natural Resources, and there was also that tension between environment and natural resources in the past. I think we moved beyond that. I think we're now in a situation where the silos are not acceptable anymore. Environment was also seen as a department who say no, because it's a regulatory body who's telling you cannot do that, you cannot do that. I think what we see now is a totally different perspective. And for us, for me, that's kind of 4 big elements. The first one is the importance to set the directions together. Where do we want to go? What is the directions and what are we aiming for? And for us, for example, be clear on what is the national project that is behind this. What is the national strategy on adaptation? What are the targets in the future? And reporting to the public and reporting to the private sectors, that people know what we're buyers for. The second point is how do you align this vision with the regulation that you have? And when I think about what we've been working over the last few years, it's difficult to believe that my friend in Treasury or Finance for us will not be involved. Just to give you a sense, and they're the same than yours, carbon pricing, clean fuel regulations, clean electricity regulation, phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, taxonomy for sustainable activities, methane regulation, oil and gas. So when you put zero emission vehicle, if you all go there and you want to work on this, your goal is not to say no. Your goal is actually to reshape the economy and making sure the economy is going where you want the economy to go and where the investments are needed. And that has to be done with our colleagues in other departments. So what I see here is not just finance or treasury working with other departments suddenly. It's actually that other departments need to work with treasury more closely on those files. So that's for me an important point. A third point, we also use, of course, what are the right tools to crowd in the private investment. In our case, there's many elements, and they're not different than what you have. We create a clean growth fund recently, investment taxation, investment tax credit, of course, very important. So it's to look at, you've got your directions, you've got the regs that explain to people where we expect the investment, and you try to de-risk by using the different tools. And finally, for my departments and for other departments, is how the international forum is becoming more important. There's not an international event where we're not talking about environment, in addition to the COPs. So it's not just something that is a part. It is something that is fully integrated in our agenda. And we need to work among ourselves to precisely make sure that there's level playing field that is there, but also that the measures that we're taking in each of our countries have some permanency over time that are guaranteed by the fact that we work together. And of course, for us, that means working for the United States of America, because you're your closest friend. But it is something that is also important, because we hear that from the private sectors, we hear that from everybody, which is, how am I sure that the measures you take in place will be there in the next 10 years? So that's the other aspect that I think is an important one.
Very good. I think, indeed, this is really about reshaping the economy, which is a huge and tall order. And so I'd like to use the balance of our time to delve into three topics. The first one will be about internal capacity and workforce skills, because you're doing things differently. So, do you have the right skill sets to get the job done? The second topic will be around that collaborative piece of that intense work that needs to happen across ministries. And the last topic will be around communication. So I'm going to start with the internal capacity question, and maybe I'll start with you again, Director Young. If you think about really integrating climate finance throughout the work of the whole budget and the implementation of it, which is equally very important, do you have the right skill sets to do that within OMB? Have you had to do things differently, get different expertise? I'd love to hear more on that.
So we are working now with, and I've met with members of European Parliament who have a lot of work in this area on making sure climate is incorporated into our economic assumptions, which are the backbone of how we put a budget together. So what is the impact of climate change on our economic indicators, from interest rates to inflation to GDP growth or not, and what that is. So we are at work, and that is one of the goals and frameworks we want to leave as a lasting legacy in how the U.S. government builds its budget, and make sure climate is one of the underpinnings of, because we must acknowledge that it has a significant economic and budgetary impact. And so the economic piece takes longer to build in. The budget piece we've seen for years. You heard me talk about being from the state of Louisiana. Hurricane Katrina and I unfortunately share an anniversary. It struck in 2005 on my birthday. What a devastating thing to watch on television. I just moved to D.C. a few years before that, and to see that. And now that level of storm is the norm we see coming through the country. We just, in our last funding bill in September, needed $16 billion more to make sure our Federal Emergency Response Agency stayed afloat, because they do hurricanes, fires, they help communities respond to all that. And we're going to need billions more just to make it through this year to September 30th. I think our FEMA administrator is at this conference because it's appropriate. It is making her work more difficult. She's doing more and more and more. So we don't have to wait. It is having a direct impact on our budgetary framework. So when you come to priorities and we have to work with Congress and what do you spend on education, this is one of those things now at the top of the ledger on what we're spending on, and that's why mitigation, adaptation is important to us domestically. Because I come from communities where you can go in and rebuild and rebuild and rebuild after storm. We can't continue to do that. It's hard to have conversations with communities who've been there a long time about ensuring that we're building in the right places. It's easy to make those decisions forward-looking, and our wetlands policies, which our courts have now made more complicated for us. But what about communities already there? How do you have that conversation with them? So that has been a part of our reality for a long time. But on the economic side, on our macro side, we all know climate is going to play and is playing a huge part in that, and we are working on developing that into our economic assumptions, as well as seeing the direct impact into our budget, which we're seeing to the tune of billions of dollars already.
Thank you for that. And I know that through the Coalition of Finance Ministers, and I think we have a good collaboration with Denmark, I think your point about we need to completely update our macroeconomic models, and any perspectives from you on this issue?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, in October I have a summer house, and it was flooded. And so now I'm fighting with the insurance companies, and we had a little area with 150 summer houses, and 100 of them were hit by flooding. From the sea, and it was a 100 years event, and it asked the question, should we rebuild, or is it possible? Is it possible to prevent it for the next 100 years? When will it happen again? That's just one small example. Obviously, as a owner of a summer house, it's pretty irritating, to say the least. But it asks the question, we are fighting all these fires, but do we actually know what the insurance policy costs, and what does it take to prevent it? And so that's why we, as a supplement to the macroeconomic models that we have, doing under the theme of green reform, try to actually figure out how do we put the cost on climate change, and how do we model it into reshaping into our budget and all the legislation we do. What are the price of the climate change? And so we are pretty far on this work. We do it together with you also, I know, as a personally. And so thank you very much for a very close cooperation between Denmark and the US in this matter. And I think it's very important because, if we need, obviously we're all very focused on implementing our ambitions and our goals, but now it's very difficult to actually get it into our economic model. So that's what we are doing at the moment, because it will also shape the new policies we do when we actually can figure out what are the price, if we do, if we don't, etc. So that's one very big area. And then you ask also another important question: do we have the right capacity? Obviously, Denmark, as being a small country that like to tell ourselves that we are a front runner. But we're also realistic. We know that we can only do this in a partnership, and it has to be globally. And so that's also why we're very keen on working internationally. But another question about capacity is that in Denmark we have full employment. One of our biggest challenges in this green transition is actually we don't have labor enough. So With all the plans we have, we also have to prioritize pretty hard, because it's the same people who are going to do infrastructure, who's going to do new windmills, etc., etc., etc. So we're working very hard together with the private sector to actually get all hands on deck and to figure out how do we change. For example, we did a reform of our educational system. Should wrap it up, but in Denmark, our university system was built at a time where maybe 3 to 5% of the population would take a long university degree. At the moment, it's almost 30%. And so we need skilled labor that can actually build a windmill, that could be engineer, that can, do the infrastructure. So now we're starting to cap a little bit on how many should take a university degree and what kind of university degrees do we need, and how do we, get more young people to actually be interested in, being the heroes of the green transition, actually do the hard work to transform this. Otherwise, we won't be successful. So it's not only a matter do we have the right people at the state level and doing the modeling. It's also very much a question about do we have the right people to actually implement policies.
Right. So, yeah, across the different sectors, and then starting with the educational system. Interesting. So, Minister Aberleche, you've been, personally such a strong champion for climate. But again, same question, within your ministry, do you have the right skill sets? What are you doing around the capacity issues?
I think that in the last years we have made a lot of progress in terms of capacities, not only in the Ministry of Economy and Finance, but also in the other ministries, because this is related to your other point, coordination. So now we have in the Environmental Ministry, in the Livestock Ministry, in the Industry Ministry, people speaking economic language. So it's not now not anymore just about looking at the measures, but putting price into that measures. So the idea of cost effective comes to everybody. It's not only implementing the measures. We have to implement the most cost effective measure. The idea of seeing what impact on a macroeconomic level the NDCs have, and for that we have a macroeconomic model in place, it's also very important. On the other side, in the Ministry of Economy and Finance, well, we now have an environmental team. Here we have the head of the environmental team sitting in the audience. And this team has to coordinate with the fiscal team, with the budget team, with the tax team, with the trade team, and so on. So there is a new area, new people in this, looking at this topic. And of course, we also have to learn other things, like, for example, in Uruguay, 3/4 of the greenhouse emissions comes from cattle, from methane. So we had to learn how to measure the methane from cattle. It's not, you cannot measure it, you have to estimate it. You cannot measure from it animals. So those are the kind of joint work that we have worked together. We had to learn about greenhouse gas emissions. They had to learn, other ministries had to learn about the economic language. But I think that is what made it coordination easier. As I mentioned before, we have these two financial instruments that have key performance indicators. So we are linking together financial aspects with environmental aspects. One of these indicators is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We had to know about how to estimate this. The other one is the conservation of native forestry. We had to learn how to measure the amount of forestry we have, etc. The other one, in the loan, the indicator is about the reduction of methane. Again, we had to learn about this. So I think it's been a lot of work, but of course more is to come once we see that we have to work together, environmental policy and economic policy.
As the only non-finance person, I would say you don't need any capacity, you just have to listen to us, we'll tell you, but I'm teasing. I would touch 3 points that are quite similar. The first one is mobility. It's my 6th department as a deputy minister, so I did 6 different departments. It's not uncommon for a lot of us to do and work in many departments during our career, and it does help. So a lot of my employees who are working on modeling and macroeconomic consequences actually work at finance before. And I'm sure they're still talking to their friends over there. And when we develop those policies, and when it's about the economic consequences, I sit down with my colleague at finance. It's done together, and sometimes they will do part of the analysis. We need to do it more and more with other departments. Is how do we work together? That it's not just one department comes with its own assumptions, and after that, finance has to do the challenge function. So how do we do it together? We save time too when we can do it right. The second one for me that is an important element is we're working on a climate lens. We did develop in the past with finance a GBA plus lens, diversity and inclusion lens. So when any departments wants to submit a proposal for the budget, they have to do that assessment. And if you start including it in the assessment, that means that people at finance needs to be able to assess it too and see if the assessment is good. That creates a discipline across the board for people to have at least some knowledge about climate change or what it means and a capacity to assess their policy based on this. And the third one is training. We do have internally in the public service a school of public service. And we plan to train by COP29 30,000 public servants on climate change. And what does that mean from a policy perspective? So for me, those are the three major points that I think help us and that we need to reinforce is that mobility, making sure people come and go and can see the two sides and have a better understanding, using lens to force the discipline across the system, and training.
Can I just ask you on your second point? Because, in Denmark we have, for every legislation, you have to be aware of the climate change. You have to be aware of, how does it score towards, gender equality, etc., etc. Of obviously the economic and administrative side of it. But if you don't have the underlying tools to actually figure out what are the real consequences, it seems to me that it sometimes is more of a bureaucracy task to fill it out, but it doesn't really drive any real change. I mean, so how are you successful in implementing this?
That's where the role of finance treasury is important. If it becomes a sine qua non conditions to get funding in a budget, people figure out how they will do that. I find that in our case, we had before lens that were not necessarily efficient, a bit like you say, it's kind of feeling sometimes good, sometimes not good, but most of the time disappointing. The fact that it's really taken into account in the budget process, the fact that we report more on this was really helpful on GBA Plus, for example, and that's where we want to aim for in the context of climate change, is that people, when they do make their proposal, when they come for consideration, there is actually almost a pass or fail on the quality of the work done on that side.
If I can, one thing, as a part of the methane rule, the rule made all the headlines, but part of the rule was the value, the social cost of greenhouse gas, which we're also not just in our rules trying to set that level, which EPA has said and is groundbreaking, but also using that value in budgeting and how we make decisions and prioritize, knowing what the social cost of those emissions are in measuring budget decisions by that. So that's also going to be, I think, a game changer. We're in our infancy on doing this on the budget side. The regulatory side, we've been doing it in America since 2008. The value was too low. Now with EPA coming out with a higher value, it's going to be game changing on the regulatory side, but on the budget side, we're also beginning to use that value in that way.
Yeah, no, and in our case, for example, Canada is quite big in terms of size and country. You talk about evacuation. I was before working at Indigenous Services Canada. It happened some years where we evacuate 2 times the same community. So this is kind of so when you develop policy, the impact downtown Toronto would be different than in the north, would be different and that becomes systematically the questions asked. Can you quantify that? Can you show us what would be the price for people in different regions? And how do you take that into account? And what is your mitigation strategy if the impacts are different? So that's, for me, some important element.
So now I want to turn now to the issue of collaboration, which has come up already quite strongly, but I do want to delve a little bit more deeply in it, because you're almost making it sound like it's happening organically, almost easily. So I think I just want to hear a bit more from you, including of the challenges that you've faced in trying to have that more integrated approach. And if I could ask for sort of brief answers, please, and maybe I'll start with Minister Aberleche.
And the question, Alexis, sorry?
On the collaboration piece across the different ministries, it sounds like it's starting to happen, but it sounds almost like it's happening too very easily. Is that true? Yeah, so I want the real story.
Okay, so the answer is no, it hasn't been easy. I think that in Uruguay's case, the fact that we went into the issuance of this first sustainability-linked bond was a huge a push for us. We had to coordinate because we had this specific. And in our case, the president was very much involved in the coordination amongst not only the Ministry of Economy and Finance, Environment, Industry, Livestock, but also Foreign Affairs. So it was the president himself that helped us in the organization of this.
Specific goal and then leadership from the top matters. Minister Bruce.
Well, when we put all our ambitions and plans together, we need 130% of the area of Denmark to be successful. So obviously, we could go to war with Sweden and try to win some land, but it seems that it is a long-term strategy. So we have a lot of ambitions, we have a lot of goals, we have a lot of policies. One of our greatest concerns now is implementing it. And obviously there's a lot of cooperation, and we're not successful. Because what we are doing, we have we have ministers' meetings every week. We all agree. We all agree that, now we have to do something about bureaucracy, and, we are very keen on building windmills at sea in Denmark. It takes around 7 or 8 years. It takes 2.5 years to actually build the windmill. It takes 5.5 years to go through bureaucracy, both at national and European level. And so everyone agrees that, now we have to do something, and we look into our own agencies and we cooperate, but we move too slowly. So that's also one of the huge barriers, actually, to be successful. And for me, it's not a question about, would we collaborate or not? We will. But we are not effective enough in actually implementing. And it seems very, very difficult, especially since it's also a matter about, how do we get people to understand that, if you want to build a windmill, there's some people there who own, maybe if it's on land, that own the land. What are the benefits? What are the rights to complain? What about the biodiversity, etc., etc., etc.? What about the churches in Denmark? We have a lot of churches in Denmark, and they have an old tradition that they can decide, if you stand at a church and you look over the field, so if there's a windmill 5 miles ahead, they can actually block it. So just to give one small example. So we spend a lot of time on trying to be better at implementing.
Yeah, and the issue of the speed of the implementation matters tremendously here.
Yeah, no, I would 3 points on this, on the challenges. And there could be more, but I don't think we want to stay 5 hours. But the first one is keeping the momentum. The first meetings between departments or ministries are good. But how do you make sure that they focus on making real changes? There's always a risk that you end up with so many meetings and not necessarily the result you're getting. The second one is the first measure of success sometimes is not the good one, which is we're getting more programs. And for people outside, they see it as not necessarily a coherent effort. So how do you make sure that you have as much as possible in this effort something that is actually flexible enough for people outside, but also that is actually fully comprehensive and integrated. So that's another challenge. And the third one is we need to work with people outside. We, in our case, a lot of engagements with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis population, which is fantastic and amazing, and we are achieving good results. But it is also something on how do you develop solutions that actually build the resilience at the community level and unlock the capacity and the willingness of the community to make a difference. We have provinces to work with too, so aligning all the level of governments, including international, is not necessarily easier, and we haven't talked yet about the industry and social groups, so that comes back to, Louisiana example. How do you get the population on your side, and how do you make sure that the approach that is good for one state or one place is also good for the others? And that's a very challenging.
My agency is the convener of other federal agencies. It's literally what we are there to do. Often disagreements, comments, we are the receptor of, this is why major regulations come through the Office of Management and Budget, because if one agency puts forward a regulation, they don't know what 3 other agencies are doing in that space. Coming to us gives all the agencies a chance to comment, and lots of stuff comes out in that process that makes it a better product, and that we don't have unintended consequences when that doesn't happen. So it's a necessary step. But I feel the pain. Like, we talk a lot in the U.S. about permitting reform. We have to give communities a way to express issues with projects that come up, but it is causing a lot of delay on renewable energy projects. And there has been a lot of conversation between both parties in the United States about the need to do something to speed up projects. We don't want to take away the rights of individuals to have legitimate environmental complaints, historic preservation complaints. You have to keep that for communities, but time is of the essence on these renewable energy projects. What's funny, one of the longest processes is through one of our landmark environmental laws, NEPA, and the National Environmental Protection. So, our climate and environmental objectives sometimes find themselves in conflict, which is a really odd thing on just a time frame. We are our court system, so people use those laws to sue, and some of our transmission projects are taking 5, 6, 7 years to happen. What happens in private business when they can't hold on that long? You see the opportunity for them to drop out of the project. So we've got to do something about permitting reform, and the President's committed to working with anybody who claims they want to do something about it and how long these projects take. So that's key on our agenda. But our process in America, you well know, takes a partnership with Congress. One of the reasons I think the President wanted me in this job is because there are a lot of goals we have to do, but on a bipartisan basis, we have to get those done. And I spent most of my career working for Congress, now working and begging and pleading and yelling and screaming. My no's aren't just for my own group. A lot of that to Congress. We have got to. I talk about this need to. Some things we could jam through, but it's not lasting. We've got to find a coalition of American government. Not everything's broken. If people like to be talked to, consulted. So I spend a lot of my times reminding people we got to find that bipartisan governing. They might not call it climate. They might call it mitigation. They might call it resiliency. I'm a big believer in meeting people where they are. They have their own politics that they have to be careful for. So I'm a big believer in trying to build something that is lasting, that both parties can support, understanding the political situation in which we have to accomplish all of these things. And there's an avenue here, and we've shown that. So we got a lot of work to do, but what we are here to do is to collaborate, force that collaboration, sometimes pick sides on who gets to win out of that those disagreements. We got a lot of work to do, and we need Congress to be a partner to make sure we can meet all of our objectives.
Absolutely. So you've set us absolutely well, Director Young, for the last remarks from everyone, which is on this question of communication. And all of you in different ways have talked about it needs to be lasting. We need permanence. And so in addition to all the tools and budget tools and innovations and tax reforms, we also need to win hearts and minds. And so, starting with the far end of the panel, when you think about your communication challenges, what you've been able, who you need to communicate to, what lessons can you share with the audience? Maybe a minute each, please.
I would go further than that. I think the real issue is an engagement issue, because we're never going to be, our efforts never going to be sufficient. We need people to take their own responsibility and be activists in some way and transform people who transform the situation. So how do you provide the right information to the communities for people to make their good decision makers at all levels? How do you make sure that you support them in their decision makings? How do you make sure that they have access to what's going on and they see what they can do to actually maximize their chance of success in this economic transformation? That comes with a lot of potential and a lot of positive aspect, and people don't look at them. They tend to look at what they may lose and not what they're going to get. And I think for us, that's the real challenge. And we're doing that. We try to do that by intensive, as much as possible in any of our initiatives, really strong engagement. Minister of, on the natural resources side, they have regional tables working with industry, but also with our friends at the provincial level, trying to develop what is the plan, how do we work together.
So maybe the question is, why is the Ministry of Economy and Finance so much involved in climate action, adaptation, tackling climate issues in general? And I think that the answer is that it's not only because we care about the planet, our people, but as Ministry of Economy and Finance, our ultimate goal is to increase employment and the quality of employment for our people. So we are, as you've said, we are facing, we're going through a new paradigm in the way services and goods are produced, in the way that the investment takes place. So if we really want to grow and have more employment as Ministry of Economy and Finance, we have to incorporate environmental issues. And I think that that is what we're doing. And I think that the population in Uruguay has this clear. Why is the Ministry of Economy and Finance so much involved in environmental issues?
Well, I don't think you can sugarcoat bad policies. And so if we don't create jobs, if we don't are socially balanced, we'll fail. Everyone here knows Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish girl who protested and created a worldwide movement of young people. What many people probably don't know is that a lot of young Swedish people voted at the National Swedish Party at the last election. Why? Because they increased the tax on diesel. And a lot of young people are actually traveling pretty far in their car. And so what happened to the Greta Thunberg generation in Sweden? And why did they vote like that? Not because of bad communication, but because they felt not heard, and they saw the price of their vehicles were rising without being engaged. And so I think that's the biggest trap and the biggest consequences of policies. If we are not successful in creating jobs, if we are not successful in doing it social balanced, it will be short-term policies, because it will have a throwback. They have, it will be different politicians making different decisions. We saw the last election in Netherlands just a few weeks ago, with the consequences of the nitrogen theme mostly in the Netherlands. Now it's a task for a new government. I think they will face the same challenges, but with different answers. So I think that's extremely important. And that's also why when I was introducing that we do actually carbon pricing, I'm well aware that it's not a case in many parts of the world, but it can only be done in a very close cooperation with communities, with the sectors, and also trying to reach our goals, but not without, creating too much resistance.
Backlash risk is high.
I think I've been saying some version of this for a few rounds, that we have to do these things we can't ignore the political environment all of us live in. So our policies, we need advocates to push government. That's absolutely necessary, important part of democracy. Governments would not move in many directions without young, active push to do certain things, and that is absolutely critical. But we also, as my new friend just pointed out, when people start losing political elections because they have done policy without that have had unintended consequences, those things aren't lasting. So how do we build lasting change where people don't feel that they have to take political risk in order to do them? That is why I don't care if you call it mitigation, resilience. Find a way to meet people where they are so they can support these very important goals, but understand the boxes they find themselves in. So that is what I spend my career doing. Everyone has a role to make sure we're successful here. But I remind people, I have to know what Republicans are facing in their districts. We talk about these things. There's stuff they tell me because I work with many of them that they can't do. I know they can. So not everything you take on face value, but some things I get it. And you try to work in a constructive way. We have divided government in the United States. And we have to find a way to make these bold things through some administrative tools we have. But in a lot of these funding areas, we still need to find a way to get these things through Congress. And I started with, this president secured over $9 billion in international climate. It's possible. We just have to be smart in the way that we approach them. But communications is important. Reaching communities who have often felt left behind is important. Building their capacity on the ground. The federal government does a lot, but not all. Like, most people actually feel what their local mayors and city councils do more than what we sit in our federal seats can feel. So giving those, frankly, those states and localities who can go further than we can, the tools, and a lot of times they go prove the case that it can be done. Sometimes we're not the first movers at the federal level. Our states are, some of our cities, and that's incredibly important. We often have to catch up with them, but that's not the worst thing to happen, to have them move ahead of us sometimes to prove that it can be done on the federal level, given how complex our political system is. So it's an exciting time. Young people are excited about climate. And it pushes us and keeps us accountable, but we have to do it in a smart way to make sure it's sustaining and long-lasting.
I'm sure the audience will join me in my view that if we have leaders like the ones on this panel in charge, that a lot of what we're discussing here at COP has a potential to really become reality. I'm grateful for your leadership, all four of you. It matters tremendously. Thank you so much for this conversation today. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us for this session today. Panel is over. Thank you.